Good morning. Nice to see you all. I'm going to stand off to the side because I'm too short to stand behind this computer. But I'm going to cover a few things here. Just an overview of the state budget, how higher education formula funding works for general academics. I'm not going to go into the formula funding for health institutions, but similarly, they have a formula funding system as well. And then some of the legislative funding issues for higher education that may come up in the next legislative session, and then how all of this flows into an institutional budget at one of our institutions in Texas. So, first of all, a state budget funding sources overview. So there are a lot of different funding sources for higher education and just the state in general. State tax collections, federal funds, a lot of other things, lotteries in here. And there are details about how all of these work. So general revenue is the primary funding source for the state of Texas. That's basically the state tax dollars. So you can see here state tax revenues, lottery proceeds, investment income, and many state fees are included in the general revenue. So these are the funds that the state legislature is allocating across the various agencies and institutions in Texas. Federal funds are grants from the federal government. There are also some employee programs, benefit programs that fall under federal funds. General revenue dedicated is funds that the state also appropriates, but it's generated within either a different agency or institution. So you can see here, for our purposes, tuition revenue falls under general revenue dedicated. It's still considered appropriated funds, but it is actually generated within our institutions. And then the other funds, state highway funds, Texas Mobility Fund, bond proceeds, trust funds. Most of these, well, some of them apply to higher education, but one at the bottom, Available University Fund, specifically applies to Texas A&M and University of Texas system. And that's the Available University Fund is part of the Permanent University Fund, our West Texas lands, the main endowment for those two institutions and systems. So the state budget overall, this is the 16-17 biennium. We don't quite have the information yet from the legislature on the 18-19 biennium, but probably similar, overall allocations. The general revenue makes up the largest part, so 106 billion of the 209 billion, the little blue pie. General revenue dedicated is a much smaller percentage. Federal funds, the green pie, about 32%, and then all the other funds, about 13%. So that's just a picture of the whole state in general, overall funds. Now, if you just look at the state budget and how it's allocated by function, Health and Human Services is the biggest part. So you can see these are the decisions that the legislature is making during a session. They've got to fund Health and Human Services, public education, higher education, judicial services. So right now, higher education is about 9.6%, the little purple pie here, of the overall state budget. And then if you just look at the general revenue piece, so that piece that comes from state tax dollars only, higher education is about 13.8% of the general revenue budget. And Health and Human Services, as well as public education, are the largest pieces of the state pie for general revenue allocations. So how do these funds get allocated to our general academics? Again, this is general academics, not health institutions. So there's formulas, and the coordinating board is heavily involved in developing the formula systems. So the formulas are designed to equitably allocate the funds across the different general academic institutions. And then there's also non-formula funding, and the non-formula funding is the piece of, there's special items in there, there's some other things, Available University Fund, some higher education funding, which is for institutions who aren't eligible for the AUF. They get some additional higher education funding for their excellence type programs. Special items, I might point out, I'll talk about this a little bit later as well, but the special items were a big topic of discussion during the last legislative session. They actually had some pretty significant reductions of around 30% or more in some cases. Special items are things not funded by the formula, but they are maybe unique programs in an institution. For example, the University of Texas at Austin has McDonald Observatory, Marine Science Institute that was just impacted by Hurricane Harvey. So there are programs that can't be funded by a basic formula. There's something over and above that meets the needs of the state of Texas, but not every higher education institution has them. So those are the two basic components of a higher education funding. And then the formula funding is designed to fund the normal operations of an institution of higher education. So we have faculty salaries, we have departmental operating expenses, there's libraries, structural administration would be things like the dean's offices and the programs under the deans, research enhancement, student services, institutional support, so the administration of the university, and then infrastructure. And so basic things that every higher education institution has. And then the non-formula funding, so the things not in the formula, as I mentioned, the special items. Sometimes we receive tuition revenue bonds, or TRBs it's often called, and those are to fund capital renovations, new buildings, things like that. The legislature may allocate those during certain sessions, not every session. And then there's various research funding for those who are already a research university and those that are emerging research universities. And then available university fund I talked about, and I'll talk a little bit more about the auxiliary and institutional funding. But wanted to point out this picture here. I went and put it on this slide thinking it's a nice picture kind of representing our McDonald Observatory, the stars in the background. Well, I was doing a presentation for our Academy of Distinguished Teachers, so our best professors on campus, and happened to be an astronomer in the room, and he said, Mary, that is not a telescope. That's a radio transmission something. He said, I'll send you a picture of a telescope. So I apologize I didn't get it in time to replace it, but that is not a telescope. But maybe one of our institutions has a radio transmission special item, we'll see. The components of the formulas are instruction and operation. So that's basically everything that is not infrastructure on a campus. So it's all our faculty salaries, it's our operations, it's our libraries, student support. So all of that goes in instruction and operation. And then there's a formula for infrastructure support. Some institutions receive an additional support under infrastructure support for smaller institutions, since they don't have necessarily the same economies of scale. So they get some additional infrastructure support there. And then teaching experience is to put faculty members in the classroom that are on tenure track for our undergraduate students. We get some additional funding for that. So those are all pieces of the formula. And they're driven by different things. So the instruction and operations are really driven by semester credit hour. The infrastructure support, so our buildings and our facilities, are driven by several different pieces of what happens on campus. So semester credit hours is part of that, but also academic program mix, staff size, research expenditures, library size, so those are all part of the infrastructure support formula. And then teaching experience, as I said, is for credit hours taught by tenure track faculty. And then, so for the instruction and operations formula, there's a base period and weighted semester credit hours. And I'll go into a little bit more detail about this, but these are the important basic concepts to understand. So the base period is the 12-month period that is going to be the basis for determining the dollars to be allocated. It's the summer and fall of even-numbered years. So for next session, it's going to be the summer and fall of 2018 and the spring of 2019. And that base period is the base for the formula appropriations for the next 2 years. So it's a 1-year look for the next 2 years. And weighted credit hours are just a recognition that not every class that's taught on campus costs the same amount to teach. So we have a history class may not cost as much as it does to teach engineering or art, where there's labs and supplies needed. Also, graduate student courses are much smaller classes, so you would assume that they would be taught by higher faculty members at a higher salary level, as well as smaller class sizes. So the formula matrix recognizes that. And so there is a formula matrix that actually appears in the appropriations bill and makes these determinations on dollars. And the matrix is based on a cost study that every single institution in the state does. So we prepare one at UT Austin, and every other institution prepares one. And it's an estimate of our costs to teach various classes in each discipline. And so every state in Texas does this, and then the formula averages all of those. So we're looking at an average of all of the costs in the state of Texas for programs. So example, it is really just a formula. You go in, the legislature, well, the coordinating board collects all the data and does calculations based on these weighted semester credit hours and the program weighting matrix. So here you can see a lower division history course, which is in the formula matrix as a 1. So I'll show you the matrix. This is what's actually in the appropriations bill. So a history course would be under liberal arts. It's a lower division, so it's a 1. And then you just do the calculation. Every class in UT Austin and all of the institutions in the state of Texas go through this process. So as I said, this matrix then recognizes that some disciplines cost more to teach. So as you go across, upper division courses cost more than lower division, and then certain disciplines cost more. So like pharmacy, you can see towards the bottom, or 2/3 of the way down, can be quite expensive when you get into the doctoral and other hours. So really it's just recognizing the cost to teach these courses. And every institution maps to these weighting categories. So they may not have each of these disciplines, or they may not fall neatly into each of these categories, but they have to be mapped to the categories here in the formula matrix. Does that make sense? So, as I was saying, you just take the matrix times the number of semester credit hours, and a lower division course would earn $3,349 for 20 students in a classroom. And you can see what it would be for other categories. And that just happens across the whole state. So this is just showing if we had 20 students in each of these categories, that's what it would look like. So that's the infrastructure and operations support. So these are things like law school. Not every institution has a law school. So it's really just things that are more unique, but any institution that has these would use those categories. Anything else? Okay, so infrastructure support is, as I was saying, these are facilities, buildings, support for the infrastructure of the university. And it's driven by predicted square footage. So it's not how much space we actually have on a campus, but what we should have based on the types of students we have and the types of courses we're teaching, the amount of research we're doing, all of those things factor into it. And as I said, there's some small institution supplement. And then utilities, the rate may vary by location, just because utilities may cost different in different locations. But these are the space model factors. So I talked about these, the amount of space that we have in the different categories. Now, this has been recommended for changes. There was a bill recommending some change. Well, the coordinating board recommended some changes. It didn't actually get into legislation this last time. I'll talk about that a little bit as well. But there was a study that was requested by the legislature to look at this. And the coordinating board did that work, but not a whole lot of it came out of the legislative session after that. Teaching experience, I think we've covered this pretty well. It's just an extra 10% weight for teaching courses that are taught by tenure track faculty, so not teaching assistants and adjuncts. All right, so as I mentioned, we're the formulas are an average of all of the weightings across the state of Texas. It's also distributed, we have one piece of the pie and it's distributed equitably across the institutions, but growing institutions benefit from this formula approach because there's only so much piece of the pie, and if you're growing a growing institution, you'll just get a larger piece of the pie. So when all of that comes about, the general academic institutions for 16-17 had about a $4.8 billion allocation from the legislature for appropriations. And by function, you can see instruction and operations was the biggest part. That's the largest part of the formula funding. And then the different categories here, infrastructure is about 11%, and then the special items about 11%. This last legislative session, that was reduced, the special item piece. So some of the legislative funding issues that may come up in the next session, we've talked for several years about outcomes-based funding. There have been a couple different iterations of this. We've worked with the coordinating board quite a bit, but there has not been a final decision on how to actually do this in the legislature. The first outcomes-based funding, I can't remember what year it was, but it's been probably 6 years. Thank you, Mary's nodding her head. And so there was a first iteration of this, and it was really based on actual outcomes, and the basic principles were to provide outcomes funding above the base, and it would be phased in, that there would be a biennial review. There were some certain metrics and a scaled weighting. There was some set aside for hold harmless. The next iteration was really based on success metrics. So each institution really had a choice on prioritizing basically the mission of their institution. So different institutions have different missions. And so it was a way to allocate the outcomes-based funding based on the priorities of each institution. And so every institution prioritized these different categories. And then there was another iteration, which was kind of a simplified method and really looking at graduation bonus. So to actually provide bonuses for students who graduate, which is a benefit to the state of Texas to have college graduates. And so it was going to be, I think it was actually higher than this to start with, $600 for each bachelor's degree. Was reduced to $500, and then if you have at-risk students, even a higher bonus for that. These changes were actually introduced in bills in the last session. There's 2 of them here. I think there were quite a bit more, but those did not pass either. as I mentioned about the infrastructure, the space projection model, actually the coordinating board was directed to look at the model for the space projection or the infrastructure formula. And there was a proposal with some 3 alternatives, and that was presented during the legislative session, but again, that did not go forward. So the result was that there was going to be a study of the formula and non-formula funding for higher education. And so a special joint interim committee is to be appointed. I believe on the lieutenant governor's side, it has been, the committee members have been identified, but not on the speaker's side. So we are waiting. But all of this is wrapped up in the fact that the legislature actually reduced funding for higher education largely on the special items that I talked about earlier. So they really want to look at all of the special items, determine whether or not those should continue for various programs across institutions. We have done this in the past. We've worked with the coordinating board in the past on providing information on each special item, how long it's been in existence, what benefit the state of Texas receives. So I believe that's what they're going to be doing. The committee report by legislation is due in April, and as of now we don't have the 2 committees, so it's kind of stagnant right now. I don't know if any of you might know what's happening, but just wanted to make sure you're aware of this situation because the funding for special items really is dependent on this. We did receive some hold harmless funding. Are you familiar with that term? Hold harmless funding is basically funding that a legislature provides for that biennium only, and they leave it to the next biennium to decide whether or not it's going to continue or how it's going to work in the next session. So we have some temporary money to handle the reductions, but this work really needs to be done to finalize what's going to happen in the next session. So it is important. Just wanted to mention also, this was a few sessions ago, but each higher education institution was required to set up a fixed tuition plan, which would keep tuition the same for any student who signs up. It's optional. So a student who signs up in their freshman year, their tuition will remain the same for 4 years. As I said, it's a choice, but it was effective in fall of 2014. So it does impact how tuition rates are set at institutions. So I thought it might be something just that you're aware of. So how does all of this fall into an institutional funding and the budget activities that higher education is doing on a regular basis? There's different funding sources for the state of Texas, and then there are more funding sources for higher education and probably state agencies as well. But general academic institutions have these appropriated funds that we talked about, the general revenue dedicated. But there's also other income, available university funds. Some institutions get tobacco endowment funds. Some get higher education funds, which are kind of the counterpart to AUF. These are all considered appropriated funds. So the state is aware of them. They're disclosed in our legislative appropriation request and tracked that way. Then we have non-appropriated funds. And so these funds are generated at our institutions. So we have designated tuition, which is different from general revenue dedicated. I know that's confusing, but back in 2003, the legislature gave higher education Board of Regents the ability to set tuition. And that part of it is designated tuition. So that's what's set by the board. That is not considered part of appropriated funds. So it is separate. So we have different pieces of our tuition. We have a state piece and a designated tuition piece. There's also some institutions that have separate incidental fees. We get some indirect cost recovery funding from our federal grants. So when we receive a federal grant, they come on our campus to perform that, the requirement of the grant. They're using our campus buildings and our resources, and so the federal government or any granting agency pays a percentage to do that research on our campus. So that's what indirect cost recovery is. Auxiliary enterprises are really like businesses on campus. They generate their own revenue, they pay their own expenses. It's things like a student union, an athletics department. They often contribute to the university through their revenue, but totally separate and outside of state funding. And then restricted funds, I would color these red as a color of money. We cannot use these funds for anything but what the donor gave the funds for. So when we receive a federal grant, we can only use it for the grant for which it was received. We can't say, well, we're going to pay some faculty salaries out of this. Same with gifts. There are some gifts that are not restricted. They maybe use it for any purpose, but that's very rare. Normally, gifts and endowments are very specific. Use it for this building, or I want to pay for a chair in this college, those types of things. So they're very, very restricted. And this is what it looks like at a general academic institution, how the different funding sources. So statewide, state appropriated funds are about 30% of a university's budget. And tuition is about 32% now. And this was fiscal year end 2016, so it's probably changed a little bit since then. So that's kind of an overview of the financial side of it. We have a few minutes. I want to leave time for questions, so I'll run through these next few slides quickly and then leave a couple minutes for questions. This is just kind of a timeline so you can see how a budget setting process works in higher education. Usually in a legislative year, the university is developing some initial budgets, but they can't finalize it until after the session ends and we know what our appropriations are. So usually in June they're finalized and they're reviewed in central budget offices and administration, and the boards approve them in the August time frame, and the next budget starts in September, so it's a really quick process. In a non-legislative year there's a little bit more time, but legislative appropriation requests, these are what we prepare in the summer prior to a legislative session. So it's really to provide information to the Legislative Budget Board on how we have spent appropriated funds and how we plan to spend appropriated funds, as well as some details on special requests we might have, which are called exceptional items. So exceptional items, if they are approved, they become a special item. So it's something that has to be over and above what the normal formula funding would provide. And then during the legislative session, we're also doing a lot of work with fiscal notes. So every bill that is filed that's going to move forward has to have a fiscal note attached to it explaining how it will impact the institution in our case, but it could be state agencies as well, but how it will impact us. Will it cost us money to implement? Will it be, maybe it'll be a revenue generation. So it's just really looking at the overall impact financially. And then we're also analyzing the appropriations and the funding and adjusting the forecasts to let the institution and the leadership know where we stand during the session. That's just the non-legislative year schedule showing we have a little bit more. And then sometimes we get a lot of input on our budget policies and procedures. We have a lot of, because we're public institutions, we have a lot of interest from, of course, the Board of Regents, but donors and alumni, the legislature, parents and general public, and the media. And so we are always mindful of that, and we have open records requests all of the time, and we are very open about our finances. Just overall, we're always looking at how we can save funds. We're looking at how legislative decisions and bills are impacting us. Right now, we're really looking at the federal legislation and how it's impacting our graduate students and taxing them. So there's always things going on in both the state and federal legislation that can impact higher education. So I think we have just a couple minutes for questions, and I'm happy to answer anything you have. Yes?
Since you're on a campus that has, general academic campus, but also has a medical school, could you describe the fun that you've been having in figuring out how all of that is working?
Yes, it has been really fun. Well, UT Austin is a little bit unique, and UTRGV, we are unique in that we have a medical campus that is incorporated into our academic campus. That's different from all the other health institutions that are separate entities. And so we do have to do a lot of analysis to separate out our medical school expenses when we're doing our legislative request, when we're doing our cost study, which impacts the formulas on both sides. And so, yes, it has been fun, but it is very interesting how it all works. And we did receive some general revenue health institution funding for our medical school. They are also receiving funding from the AUF at UT Austin. So it is a funding model that's unique, and we are still working through how all of this is going to work, but it has generated a lot of interest with the other health institutions. How does this impact them as well? So it's been an interesting way, and the Legislative Budget Board and the Coordinating Board have been trying to figure it out with us as well. So it's different, but we're working through it, and it was worked through a good process during this last session. So. Anything else? I think we need to move on. All right?
Thank you very much.
Thank you.